All right, hello everybody. Today I have a review of a book called, here in English, it's called Inspector Imanishi Investigates, and it's probably one of the worst titles. Okay, so in Japanese, the original title is Suna no Utsuwa, or Vessel of Sand, and for some reason, when the Soho crime line got their hands on it, they decided to call it Inspector Imanishi Investigates, which is notable for its assonance, but not particularly interesting title. It doesn't even have the mystery that Vessel of Sand has, and no, there is no Vessel of Sand in the book. Anyway, this book is written by, or was written by, here's another thing. On the cover, Seicho Matsumoto, right? Well, Matsumoto is his family name, and everywhere else throughout this book, in the translation, the choice that the translator made is to do surname, family name first, and then given name last. And so, actually, if we follow that rule, it should be Matsumoto Seicho, but whatever. This is a guy who was a prolific writer of, I guess, a lot of detective fiction in Japan. In fact, he's said to have kind of popularized the genre there. He wrote over 24 novels per Wikipedia. This is the only one that I've read. It's like the fourth or fifth one that he wrote, according to what I saw in his little bibliography. Okay. The stuff on the book cover here, so I'll show you again, and we've got text on the back and all that good stuff, is kind of a weird combination of appropriate and inappropriate, right? Because we have, we have a bonsai tree, and Imanishi, in fact, does collect bonsai trees and work with them. But we also have, like, paper lanterns, which don't play a part in the story at all. And then even some of the text is a little weird, because, like, here on the front we have, from the Los Angeles Times, a superb thriller, Tantalizing, which is... To call this book a thriller, I think, is extremely wrong-headed. It's almost as if the writer at the Los Angeles Times who wrote this little tagline for it didn't even read the book, because this is not a thriller. This is much closer to a police procedural than a thriller. There's also some references on the back to Charles Dickens, what's his name? I forget the first name, but Balzac, right? And Anton Chekhov. And all these authors emphasize the insertion of realistic, world building, so to speak, like period world building in their books. And this book does a lot of that too. There's a ton of very realistic, very down to earth, very pervasive, 1960s Japanese cultural norms and conditions in this book. It is definitely a very good snapshot of how people lived at the time in that sense. It's very interesting in that sense if you want to know what that was like. But more of these on the back call it a thriller, and it's much closer to a police procedural than a thriller. There are a very small number of very high peaks of pacing and tension, but most of the book proceeds at an almost glacial pace, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is an extremely slow book. It covers multiple false starts, multiple leads that end up dying out and going cold, with as much detail as the elements which advance the plot have. So, in that sense, in a thriller, you would emphasize the exciting parts, and you would kind of, if not pass over, at least minimize the boring parts, so to speak. But this book does not do that. It's much closer to, like, this is how the investigation went. In fact, practically nothing in the story advances until at least 80 pages in. And the total length is only a little over 300. It's not a super long novel either. And even when something advances, it isn't very long before the book returns to its glacial pace, which is, just kind of the way that it works. The build-up in this book is even, I would call it, a little bit strange, because you spend most of the book, probably 2/3 or even a little bit more, pointing gradually and carefully and kind of building up a case that this one character is probably the culprit. And then all of a sudden, and without a whole lot of very clear reasoning, it seems that how can I explain this? It would be fine if something happened that moved the investigators very rapidly from saying it's this guy to saying it's that guy, right? But for the way that this book plays out, it seems almost everything is carefully justified with reason and evidence and so on and so forth as you kind of work your way through the plot. But near the end of the book, suddenly the investigators move their suspicion from character A to character B, and that's like the one part of the investigation that I don't think is very thoroughly justified in the book. I mean, I've read this a couple of times, and my most recent reading was, this weekend, or the previous weekend. But like, it has always bugged me a little bit how quickly they go from, hey, it's this guy, to, oh, hey, we're investigating this guy, and like, everything else is very well and carefully justified, and this is the one thing that is not. The other thing that happens in this book is that it ends with kind of like almost a science fiction twist, which seems very, very out of place in the world of early 1960s Japan. The conclusion is final, but not really satisfying. A lot of mysteries will have kind of a postscript, right? You catch the criminal, and then you talk a little bit about the aftermath, or you don't catch the criminal, and then you talk a little bit about the aftermath. In this book, they catch the criminal, and the book just ends, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess they got it, right? So anyway. But even with all these negative points, would I call this a bad book? Well, I wouldn't have read it 3 times if it were a bad book. In fact, I think it's a pretty darn good book. I mean, the pace is definitely an acquired taste. If you're not accustomed to books with slow paces, you probably will start snoring before you get to anything interesting in this book. But the cultural content is very intriguing and very fascinating and very genuine. There's a lot of very subtle relationships, and there's also a lot of kind of that older, post-World War II but pre-technological revolution kind of Japanese mentality. There's a lot of politeness, and there's a lot of, forms and stuff like that for the way that people interact with each other. Souvenirs and all that stuff. And all this stuff is in the book, and it's very interesting to read. Kind of these old forms that existed in Japan during this time period have shrunken down a bit in modernity, kind of like the way that people used to write letters in the Western world, and now kind of don't. You've got your email with a couple of one-sentence paragraphs, and that's what you get. Whereas, if you look at like the correspondence of a Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, you find that they were writing multiple letters a week, letters with paragraphs and, detailed ideas and conversations and stuff like that. And, it's kind of one of those things that has gone away in modern times as our attention spans get shorter, but at the same time, it's very present in this book and very welcome thing to see. As far as the actual mystery plot, there's lots of little details and little hints of opinions that kind of make things build up gradually over time. I think that's very well done. Even the false leads are kind of interesting, right? Yes, it turns out that this particular lead was a false lead, but you did get to see some character development. You did get to see some obscure area of Japan. You did get to, have some characters talk to each other and kind of express their theories to each other. You get a lot of nice additional bits, even when the plot kind of moves forward and then stops for a minute and then goes back to slow. The prose is very highly descriptive. There's lots of how can I describe it? There's lots of detailed descriptions of things, of places, of people's behaviors, of the way that people look, of the way that people react to hearing certain things. And, if you're capable of dealing with the relatively slow pace, it is an extremely relaxing read. It's kind of the perfect thing to sit down with a cup of tea on a quiet day and just kind of go through gradually and, get up at the end of a chapter and go wash a couple of dishes and then come back to it kind of thing. My basic answer is that this book is highly recommended, although it may test your ability to pay attention at times. So I think that's what I want to say for the non-spoiler section, and let's move on to the spoiler section, where I'll get into a bit of a plot synopsis if you're willing to hear it, and of course, if not, there will be chapters in the description. All right, spoiler time. So, this story begins with a very kind of typical kind of discovery, right? There's a couple of people that are getting ready to get a train started moving, and they're looking under the train, and they discover the body of a man on the tracks, put there in such a way that the man was clearly dead when he was placed there, and if they had just started the train without looking for him, they would have run him over and made things look even worse. But we end up finding this victim before the train runs him over. He was, I think, strangled, and then his face was beaten with a rock or something to disfigure him and avoid identification. In 1960 Japan, this is a pretty depraved crime, and so the investigation begins with a very high amount of investment from the local police department. However, after going through multiple kind of dead ends and false leads and cold trails, the active investigation ends, but is continued by volunteering time by the officers when they have extra spare time, basically. When they're not working on current stuff that they're actively investigating, they can come back to this. And one of the people that decides to spend a lot of his time volunteering for this one is this Inspector Imanishi. What's his first name? Ashiro, I think? For some reason I completely blanked on his first name, because he's just Imanishi through most of the book, I guess, but he does have a name. Anyway, so Imanishi continues the investigation in his spare time. And this kind of goes through multiple stages. There are multiple different leads that he's going to try to follow up on. There's multiple clues that he's trying to figure out what they possibly mean. There's the question of who the victim is, right? The victim hasn't even been identified by the time that the investigation closes, and so Imanishi is following up on possible leads for this, asking, sending out information about the victim to here, and getting back a return that says, no, we don't know who this guy is, missing person reports, that kind of stuff. Eventually they do identify the victim, but the circumstances of the victim don't make a whole lot of sense. He was basically on a pilgrimage to go to visit this shrine at a city called Ise, and Tokyo wasn't even on his list of places to go, but suddenly he ends up in Tokyo and murdered nevertheless. And it's not like he had a bunch of enemies either. He was a very well-respected police officer in the city where he basically grew up. Or had his career. And so once he is identified as the victim, it becomes a question of, well, let's see if we can maybe visit various people who knew the victim or may have known the victim and see if we can put together any connections, any additional leads. When he was in Tokyo, he was seen with this mysterious friend who nobody else can identify as well. And the assumption is that the friend was the murderer. And so now they're also trying to trace this mysterious friend and figure out who he is. And of course, there's a good chunk of the book, 2/3 or more, where you think that the person that they're looking for is one person, then all of a sudden they switch to somebody else. Another thing that happens is that we have this mysterious woman who is kind of moving around continuously. She's at one apartment one day, and then a week later she's over here, and then a couple weeks later she's over here. And it's an open question whether this is actually related to the culprit, or is it just somebody's mistress who is not necessarily related to the murder at all, and maybe she doesn't know anything at all, but finding her and tracking her down becomes a good chunk of the early plot where Imanishi is trying to keep tabs on her and failing to do so. The clues build up gradually. One of the things that helps break the story or break the case is actually a short story that appears in a magazine, where it's a story where a woman is in a train and she opens up the window and starts throwing out little pieces of paper, right? Little pieces of white paper. And it turns out that what these pieces of white paper actually were, it's funny because there's this whole thing where this guy saw it and then he talked about it to this other guy, and this other guy wrote the short story. So Imanishi visits guy B and is like, hey, tell me about that short story that you saw. Was it real or was it fiction? And the guy's like, oh no, I heard it from this other guy. So now Imanishi has to go over here and talk to this guy, and he gets this idea that maybe he should investigate what these pieces of white paper were, and he finds out, for instance, that they weren't pieces of paper, they were pieces of cloth. It was a bloody shirt that this woman cut up and threw out the window of a train to avoid creating evidence for her lover. we end up, things kind of get a little bit more worrisome when there's more deaths along the lines, and they're a combination of related to the murder and tangentially related to the murder. We have a heart attack by one guy who's about to tell Imanishi something. We have a suicide, and we have a miscarriage and death of the mother, which, it ratchets things up gradually in a way that also kind of justifies that the police department isn't taking that much of an interest in it directly. Imanishi is, but the police department is saying, no, all of these were, according to, autopsy, were natural causes. We have a heart attack, we have just a plain old suicide of someone who wasn't related to the murder mistress lady. And then we have someone who fell down and, had a miscarriage and died. So these are all, natural causes, effectively. And so Imanishi is the only one who's actually kind of following up on these even further. We end up with this very, very Japanese section where Imanishi is looking through family registers. Now, family register in Japan is something that we don't really have here in the U.S., but it's basically a government record of, who you are, where you were born, where you moved, when you moved, yada, 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 who your parents are. And then you can trace it to your parents and you can get their registers and stuff like that. And so everybody, at least in the time that this book was portraying, kind of had these family registers. However, because of the destruction of a bunch of original family registers due to firebombing of World War II, this created an opportunity for the person who turns out to be the murderer to kind of whitewash his past. He's basically trying to hide who his parents were, because another cultural issue is that his father was someone who had a debilitating illness, and being the son of someone who had a debilitating illness would look bad upon him and force and not allow him to have the social status that he now enjoys. It's a very kind of Japanese segment of the book there. And then at the end, because when we get to the family register section, this is about where the focus of the investigation moves from dude A to dude B. And again, it may be that because I'm not so familiar with the Japanese family register system that something there kind of flew past me, and that's why I didn't quite understand why they switched their suspicions from dude A to dude B. But, this is one of those things where, you would have had to localize it in order to make it make more sense at the same time. So kind of ambivalent about what the better way to handle that is. Maybe on the next reading I'll get it better. I'll understand it better, but this is my third time reading it, so if I didn't get it the third time, it's unlikely I'll get it the fourth time, and maybe it's just something, maybe it is a genuine flaw in the narrative and I'm not missing anything, but there just isn't a good justification. I don't know. Anyway, the end of the book has this very weird, sudden sci-fi-ish twist where what ends up happening is that the murderer is using high-frequency sound to harm victims, which means that the heart attack and the miscarriage were not, natural deaths, but they were actually due to this high-frequency sound. And so what ends up happening is that there's kind of this last-minute scramble to get the subject before he, basically flies off to another country, namely America, and escapes justice. And then, as I mentioned in the non-spoiler section, the book, they kind of capture him. There's a few more paragraphs, and then that's it, and the book just ends. And it's like, oh, and there's no postscript about whether he was found guilty or whatever. And I guess that kind of makes sense in the sense that once the Japanese justice system fixates on a particular person and believes they have enough evidence to arrest him, they usually, they have a very high, guilty rate when in their system, whether it is because of actually getting the right person or who knows, right? But there's no like, oh yeah, Imanishi, after he finished the case, he went and did this. In a lot of like the Nero Wolfe stories, there'll be a chapter at the end where Archie talks about like the aftermath, right? He's like, oh yeah, this guy was found guilty. This guy who was pining after this woman, they're married now, yada yada yada. This is what happened to me in the year afterwards, kind of stuff. There's none of that in this book. It just ends, and it's just like, okay, well, whatever. But yeah, that's kind of the spoiler section, I guess. So let's move on to the conclusion. Okay, in conclusion, this book, in addition to being a very solid police procedural with many interesting leads, both true and false, keeps you on your toes. This book contains a great snapshot of Japanese culture and custom in the early 1960s. We have an intelligent culprit and a bizarre method for killing. We have a secret that needs to be kept at all costs, and we have a series of events that are related not to the sins of the father, but just the circumstances of the father, which is, one of those things that's kind of like, nowadays we kind of scoff at a little bit, but it was a very real thing at the time, so it's worth thinking about. If you're interested in Japanese culture at all, especially culture in like the early 60s and kind of post-war, but pre-technological revolution, and you're willing to deal with kind of a slow pace, I highly recommend this book. If you like police procedurals, you will almost certainly really like this book. If you want a thriller, a superb thriller that is tantalizing, you will probably be a little bit disappointed. If you want... If you want a marvelous... See, some of these... Oh, that is the Los Angeles Times. Yeah. Anyway, it's... Yeah, I feel like the guy who did the Los Angeles Times review didn't read the book. But the other ones are pretty good, right? The New York Times book review says, first rate in the classic tradition of Georges Simenon's Inspector Maigret of Paris, and P.D. James' Chief Inspector Dalgliesh in England. I don't know who either of those characters are, but they sound like police procedural characters, which is closer to reality. San Francisco Chronicle says, an intriguing slice of the mores and habits of Japanese society, Matsumoto combines the prolific output of a Rex Stout, with the literary qualities of an Elmore Leonard. I haven't read any Elmore Leonard, so I don't know about that. And then Milwaukee Journal says the kind of novel Chekhov might have written had he turned his head to mysteries. And the thing about Chekhov, of course, is that he was very good at writing the way that, Russian culture was at the time of the book that he was writing. And so, in that sense, this book does display Japanese culture as it was at the time that it's supposed to be, and it's a very good snapshot of that kind of thing if you're interested. And again, it's a very good police procedural, got a lot of good characters, a lot of nice interactions between them that are interesting and subtle and multifaceted. It's a very good book if you don't care if it's slow. But if you can go through a slow book and enjoy it, 100% recommend. And that's what I've got for you this week. So yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Once again, Inspector Imanishi Investigates, or Vessel of Sand, Suna no Utsuwa, by Seicho Matsumoto. Give it a look if it sounds like it's something that you'll enjoy. And yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you next time. Have a good week.